Good day. As is traditional for this channel, I'm going to start this video with a brief or relatively brief rundown about the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine. And one interesting development is that it seems that the Russians are continuing to advance in northern Donbass towards Liman, or Krasny Liman as they call it, the town which they withdrew from back in October at the tail end of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive. And there are reports that Ukrainian losses in this area are so heavy that the Ukrainians are themselves gradually accepting that the chances of Ukrainian breakthrough in this area, especially with the fortified lines that the Russians have created, are becoming increasingly remote. And one hears reports, difficult, impossible obviously to confirm, and one must be skeptical since they tend to come from Russian sources, but one hears reports that soldiers, Ukrainian troops in this area are becoming increasingly unhappy about some of the orders to attack that they continue to be given from Kiev. I don't place much value in those reports, but there we are. The fact of the Russian advances is, I think, no longer in question, at least in this area. Well, the big news, however, remains Bakhmut, the biggest battle, in my opinion, of the war. I've been talking about this since August. I've been saying, I think I said way back in August, that Bakhmut was the most important and perhaps the largest battle of the war. It was more important than what was going on in Kharkiv region with the Ukrainian counteroffensive there. It was more important than what was going on in Kherson region with the Ukrainian counteroffensive there. It is continuing. It is getting worse and more difficult for the Ukrainians all the time. And there's been a flurry of reports about this battle finally. After it has been neglected for so long, there's now been a flurry of reports about it in the Western and in particular the British media. And I'm going to say that it's absolutely clear to me that the Ukrainian authorities, perhaps under some degree of pressure, agreed to send a team of British journalists to Bakhmut on Monday of this week, and we're gradually getting their reports. There's been a report in the Financial Times. I discussed that in my previous video. There's another report in The Guardian. I'm not going to spend time on it. I don't think it covers any fresh ground over and above what we see in the reports I'm going to cover. There's a discussion of the Battle of Bakhmut in The Economist. And this discussion now touches on the two tropes which the Western media, at least the British media, have now adopted as they prepare their public, the British public, for the prospect of Ukraine's defeat in Bakhmut. The first is that Bakhmut is unimportant, that the Russians are attacking it for essentially symbolic reasons. It's a small place, relatively small place, about 70,000 people before the war. But as I've discussed on several occasions, if you take into account the entire conurbation that makes up Bakhmut, including places like Solidar and some of these other villages or outlying suburbs around Bakhmut, it's actually probably above the whole area. The whole conurbation is probably around 100 to perhaps 150,000. That's something of a guess. But anyway, it's certainly bigger than some of the media reports imply. But anyway, it is not a huge place, and that is true. But anyway, they're saying, the British media is saying it's an unimportant place, it's insignificant. The Russians are basically wasting their time and their resources attacking it, and there are more defendable lines for the Ukrainians further east. And that's one, I would almost call it, well, it's a trope. You could almost call it a cliche. It's been repeated so often that it's practically become a cliche now about the Battle of Bakhmut. And then the second one is that the Russians are trying to capture Kiev, Bakhmut, regardless of cost. That Russian infantry is being thrown into the attack against prepared Ukrainian defenses in what are effectively human wave tactics. We had that report in the Financial Times based on the report of the claims of the one Ukrainian soldier, Konstantin. There he was with his machine gun, like a First World War machine gunner, mowing down waves of troops, Russian troops, heading towards him. And let me repeat again, neither side has resorted to human wave tactics in this war. And in fact, there have been no human wave tactics used by any side in this war, and certainly not by the Russians in Bakhmut. Russian losses in Bakhmut, as we're going to discuss, are definitely far lower than Ukrainian ones. And this whole story of human wave tactics is undoubtedly an invention. Now, I'm going to, by the way, say something about this briefly, which is that, of course, if there had been any truth to this story, if there really had been waves of Russian infantry pouring into battle, being mowed down by Ukrainian gunners in wave after wave, we would by now have had some visual evidence of this. We would have perhaps seen film of these human waves of infantry pouring into the battle zone and being mowed down in this way, or we would have seen the landscape, photographs of the landscape littered with Russian corpses. Well, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, I follow the photographic evidence produced by both sides, and pretty harrowing it is. But I have never seen anything that would suggest vast numbers of Russian casualties in and around Bakhmut. I've seen some pictures of Russian casualties, but nothing remotely on that scale. What I have seen are many, many more pictures, many, many more photographs of Ukrainian casualties in Bakhmut and around, and of course in other sectors of the battlefields. And pretty harrowing those are as well. And they do sometimes, and they very often show, large numbers of dead Ukrainian soldiers. But for the record, again, they don't look to me like the kind of pictures one would expect to see if these particular soldiers had been engaged in human wave tactics. They, on the contrary, my impression is that most of these soldiers, these pictures of Ukrainian soldiers, dead Ukrainian soldiers I have seen, in most cases, not in all cases, they are soldiers who were killed whilst on the defense, principally by Russian artillery. Anyway, every so often we have a crack in the curtain. The Economist, which as I said has written a long piece about the Battle of Bakhmut, less a case of reporting, more a case of purported analysis, repeats this trope about the insignificance of Bakhmut and its lack of relative importance. Anyway, the Economist is one article, but there's been a much more interesting article, more interesting even than the Financial Times article, in the Daily Telegraph. Now, this article begins with a very strange, I say strange, actually very accurate, but strange with the British media, title. Its title reads, "Inside Bakhmut, the strange and senseless death trap draining Ukraine's tired army." Now, this title gives an impression that the rest of the article, which in my opinion shows signs of very careful editing, is going to describe the kind of situation in Bakhmut that we're getting from Russian sources, and which has been corroborated by people like General Wesley Clark, that the defense of Bakhmut is essentially a trap, that the Ukrainians are pouring troops into trying to defend a place which is becoming increasingly undefendable, that they're suffering heavy losses, and that they are playing into the hands of Surovikin and Prigozhin, the two Russian commanders, by having their forces in Bakhmut ground down or fed into the meat grinder. By the way, the expression meat grinder appears a lot in these British articles, though it is, one would run away with the impression that it is the Russians who are being put through the Greek meat grinder here. But in fact, as I said, it's almost certainly the Ukrainians. Anyway, that's the title of the article. The rest of the article doesn't quite bear the title out. It's not exactly describing this. It gives the impression that things are not quite as bad for Ukraine as this title rather suggests. But anyway, and of course it does repeat some of the tropes. It talks about Bakhmut's relative insignificance, which of course begs the question of why in that case Ukraine is defending it to the level that it is. And in fact, the article on that point says the very intensity of the Russian offensive and the steep casualties by the defenders under relentless barrages, Russian barrages, have made it totemic for Ukrainian forces. And we go on to read, some Ukrainian troops describe the defense of Bakhmut as being a new Mariupol. Mariupol, of course, was the city in Donetsk region which the Russians captured, where Ukraine suffered very, very heavy losses, and where the Russians ultimately won. But anyway, that's the way this story is being reported by the Daily Telegraph. It's about the relative insignificance of Bakhmut. But again, you see, and this is the interesting thing about this article, points are made which appear to contradict that narrative. You get the sense that the reporter, the writer of this article, doesn't quite believe in this unimportance of Bakhmut. He's just admitted in this very same sentences that the Ukrainians are suffering steep casualties under relentless Russian barrages. And you then go on to read, yard by yard, the encroaching Russian forces have got within only a few miles of the city centre after capturing two strategic crossroads to its east and northeast. Note that there is no identification of precisely what those two crossroads are, where those two crossroads are, and we're talking about only a few miles of the city centre. My information, for what it's worth, is a lot less than that. But anyway, there we go. And it goes on to say Russian forces are also thought to have taken limited ground to the south of the city. That is not true, as they seek to encircle the town and strangle the defenders. So you get hints that things are not quite as good for the Ukrainians as other parts of the article might make you think. Unusually, amongst this flurry of articles that have come out in the British media recently, the article also refers to the Wagner Group as being the providing the major assault forces, and the Prigozhin is discussed, the founder of the Wagner Group, or the self-declared founder of the Wagner Group, is also mentioned and even quoted briefly. And we then go on to read footage from inside Ukrainian field hospitals, shows surgeons trying to stabilize a steady stream of badly wounded soldiers. Ukrainian forces are paying a high price to hold the city in the face of sometimes overwhelming artillery. We have Anton Gerashchenko, a rather powerful Ukrainian politician, by the way, who's an advisor to the Interior Ministry. I say powerful. Some Russians would have a rather less complimentary words to give to Gerashchenko. But anyway, to say about Gerashchenko. But anyway, he is reported in this article as admitting that doctors in Bakhmut are performing miracles, but deal with an unbelievable amount of suffering every day, every hour, as they work tirelessly. And further on, we actually learn something else. We learn that in Bakhmut, in artillery terms, the Ukrainians are very, very heavily outnumbered. At one point in the article, there is a comment about how the Russians, and I'm quoting now from the article, this is in fact a quotation from a Ukrainian soldier: "For every artillery piece we have," that's the Ukrainian military has, "they have 9. So the Russians are putting down vast amounts of artillery, shelling Bakhmut almost continuously. They're able to shell all the roads now that lead into Bakhmut. And I got a report earlier this morning, by the way, this is from a Russian source, that every part of Bakhmut is now subject to shelling by the Russian artillery. And this goes on 24/7 and also all hours of the day. So this is a massive battle. And the Daily Telegraph article tries hard, but to try to make things look perhaps more favorable for Ukraine than they really are. It tries to make things look worse for the Russians than they can realistically be. Bear in mind, by the way, that since this is a war fought mainly through artillery, that artillery is the major cause of the dead and wounded in this battle. If the Russians do outgun the Ukrainians by 9-1 in the Battle of Bakhmut, which, by the way, I think is possible, then almost by definition, they're going to be suffering far fewer losses than the Ukrainians are. So an interesting article from the Daily Telegraph, one which, as I said, has to be read closely, one which, as I said, bears the hallmarks of careful editing, but one which also suggests a very difficult position for the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. One senses that this situation is becoming almost untenable for the Ukrainians. And I can't help but think, and this is a point which many have made, that this constant harping on how unimportant Bakhmut is a sign that the Western public, the British public in this case, are being prepared for the fact that Bakhmut is about to fall. Now, on that subject of Bakhmut's relative unimportance, on the subject also about how what a relatively small place Bakhmut is. It's, as I say, only relatively small. It's not an insignificant place. But anyway, on those points, I can remember exactly the same thing being said way back in the late spring, early summer, when the Russians captured Popasnaya, this relatively small town in Lugansk region. And it was been heavily fortified by the Ukrainians in much the same way as Bakhmut has been. And it was fought over for 2 months. Bakhmut has been fought over for 4 months, but Popasnaya is smaller, significantly smaller. There was bitter resistance, but eventually the Ukrainians were driven out. And I can remember when they were driven out, lots of reports that in the media, in the West, Popasnaya really isn't important. It's small, it's insignificant, that the Ukrainians are retreating to more defendable lines. And in fact, it turned out that Popasnaya was the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Lugansk region. And with Popasnaya captured, the Russians were able incrementally over the next few weeks, incrementally and methodically, to capture all the major towns, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Rubizhnoye, all the others, all the major towns in Lugansk region, which was still under Ukrainian control. And I've been told, and I've no reason to disbelieve, that Bakhmut is similarly important. If Bakhmut is indeed captured, then the entire Ukrainian position in Donetsk region will start slowly, incrementally to unravel for rather the same reasons. It is because it is the linchpin for the defense system, the Ukrainian defense system in this part of Donbass. Now, I would, of course, add the further obvious point which many have made and which you can see also puzzles the Daily Telegraph reporter, at least the title suggests so. The title talks about Bakhmut, the strange and senseless death trap. Notice the word trap. Draining Ukraine's tired army. No real discussion about how the Ukrainian army is tired, but of course that is consistent with the kind of things we've been hearing from people like Brian Beletic at the New Atlas about how Ukraine is running out of men and machines to wage the war, how the repeated mobilizations that Ukraine has undertaken, that they're basically tapped out, that Western arms supplies to Ukraine are starting to run down and fade. The West still manages to scrabble together weapons from one place or another. I read, just as by way of example, that the United States has found some spare parts for T-72 tanks in Morocco, of all places, and that they're all going to be bought up and sent to Ukraine to keep what's left of Ukraine's tank fleet running. It sounds pretty awful to me. But anyway, that's just one example. But anyway, tired army, a tired army, but that's the Daily Telegraph article talks about that. You don't see much about it, as I said, anywhere else in the article itself, but the title refers to it being a tired army. And of course, it talks about Bakhmut as a death trap, and it's clearly a death trap for Ukraine's army, not the Russian, despite what the rest of the article appears to imply. And I cannot imagine that the Ukrainians would be paying this enormously heavy price to try to cling on to Bakhmut, if it was really as insignificant as all of these articles in the British media want us to think. So, more confirmation, if you like, that things for Ukraine in Bakhmut and indeed in Donbass are going badly wrong, and consistent with the information I've been getting from the various sources, the various Telegram channels that I have been looking at. Anyway, let's move on to more political topics. Putin has been busy. He attended this important summit in Bishkek. In my previous program, I said I would touch on what he said there, on the various discussions that took place there. I should say that I saw he came across to me as being in an ebullient mood, very cheerful, very confident. He spoke about the success of the Russian economy in weathering the sanctions. He talked about the relatively small GDP contraction of around 2.9% is now expected that Russia is going to experience this year. He talked about how inflation in Russia is falling, that it's probably going to give an annual figure of around 12% for the whole year. But of course, the actual rate of inflation, the day-to-day rate of inflation, has now fallen significantly from that point. He predicts a rate of inflation of around 5% for 2023, perhaps even less, perhaps very close to the central bank's 4% target. And he talks about what will be a strong recovery in Russia next year with continued growth going forward. So there's an awful lot about that. And of course, he talked a lot about the military operation. He said that everything is stable and going well, that the situation has been stabilized. In other words, the Ukrainian counteroffensives have been absorbed and held back. And of course, in Donbass, things are proceeding and proceeding well. And he spoke about the situation going essentially according to plan. And of course, he also talked about, and this is a large part of the discussions that he gave there, about the continued integration of the various economies of the Eurasian Economic Union, the various constituent republics that made up the former Soviet Union, that all became independent states when the Soviet Union collapsed, but which, via the Eurasian Economic Union, some of them at least, are in the process of reintegrating their economies again. And he talked a lot about all of that too, and about the situation in the Caucasus and all sorts of things of that nature. But perhaps the most interesting parts of the discussion were what he had to say about Merkel's comments about Minsk, the ones that have appeared in Der Spiegel, but perhaps perhaps the comments also in Die Zeit, which are the ones arguably which have attracted the most attention. Now, I've already made clear my own personal views about this. I think that Merkel is being less than honest with Die Zeit. I think she actually I think she actually did expect and hope back in February 2015 that the Minsk agreement would indeed be implemented and that it would find a pathway towards peace in Ukraine. I understand that is a view that many people are not taking from Merkel's words, but I'm going to quote them. This is a translation, and the translation is from Bernhard at the Moon of Alabama. And can I just say that his take on Merkel's words is very close, is essentially the same as mine. But anyway, this is Bernhard's translation of Merkel's exact words. Zeit, do you ask yourself if the years of relative calm, this is about Minsk, were also years of emissions, and if you were not only a crisis manager, but also partly the cause of crises? Interesting question, by the way. Anyway, Merkel then goes on to say, I would not be a political person if I did not deal with that. And then some stuff about climate action, all that. Let us look at my policy towards Russia and Ukraine. I come to the conclusion that I made the decisions I made back then in a way that I can understand today. It was an attempt to prevent just such a war. The fact that this was not successful does not mean that the attempts were wrong. And then the question continues. This is Zeit, but one can still find it plausible how one acted in earlier circumstances and today, in view of the results, consider it wrong. And then Merkel responds to this. But that also requires you to say what exactly the alternatives were at the time. I thought the initiation of NATO accession for Ukraine and Georgia, discussed in 2008, was wrong. The countries neither had the necessary prerequisites for this, nor had the consequences of such a decision been fully considered, both with regard to Russia's actions against Georgia and Ukraine, and to NATO and its rules of assistance. Now, before I go on quoting what Merkel said, can I say that given what Merkel says about this, about the decision to extend the invitation to Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO in 2008 being wrong, Merkel made a catastrophically bad decision in 2008, and she doesn't admit that. Because what she did in 2008 was that she said that Georgia and Ukraine should not be given a NATO membership action program, but she still allowed the invitation from NATO to be made to Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO one day. So she opened up allowed the whole topic of NATO membership for Ukraine to be opened up, despite her own admission that Ukraine and Georgia were not ready for NATO membership, and that the consequences of that decision had not been fully considered. So it was already, she may not be saying this, but in fact, this is an admission by Merkel that the decision she made in 2008 to allow the invitation to be made to Ukraine to join NATO, that decision was actually wrong, and dare I say it was an act of political cowardice. Merkel was afraid to stand up to the Americans and the British and the Poles and the Baltic states and all the usual assortment of people who wanted to keep the process of NATO eastward expansion ever going forward. And that's an important point to make, because arguably it was that decision in 2008 to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO, which is at the root of the current crisis. But anyway, I'm not going to spend more time on this. This is a big topic, and we'll be discussing it in more detail shortly on the Duran itself. But to continue with Merkel's words, and this is when she talks about Minsk. This is the words that are seen as the admission. And the 2014 Minsk agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine time. It also used this time, that's to say Ukraine did, to get stronger, as you can see today. The Ukraine of 2014-2015 is not the Ukraine of today. As you saw in the Battle of Debaltseve in early 2015, Putin could easily have overrun them at the time, and I very much doubt that the NATO countries could have done as much then as they do now to help Ukraine. And then there's a long discussion about Nord Stream 2, which I'm not going to discuss. So that's the comment. She's saying that the Minsk agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine time. And it's been seen as an admission. It's actually a very, as Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama rightly says, it's a very evasive comment. On the one hand, Merkel is saying that she was trying to achieve a lasting peace. On the other hand, she contradicts herself in the next answer, following the next question, by saying that Minsk was really just an attempt, a cynical attempt, to buy Ukraine time. Now, there's been a lot of comments about this, about Ukraine, Merkel's responsibility, the cynicism of Merkel's comments, and of course, all of this has now elicited a response from Putin. And these were Putin's words about Merkel's comments at which he made in Bishkek. Putin, and this is Putin's words, honestly, this was a complete surprise to me. This is disappointing. Frankly, I did not expect to hear this from the former Federal Chancellor, because I always thought that the leaders of the Federal Republic of Germany were sincere with us. Of course, they were on Ukraine's side and supported Ukraine, but I still thought they had always been sincerely striving for a settlement on the principles which we had agreed on and which were accepted, including in the Minsk agreements. What you have just said only shows that we did everything right by starting the special military operation. Why? Because it transpired that nobody was going to fulfill these Minsk agreements. The Ukrainian leaders also mentioned this in the words of former President Poroshenko, who said he signed the agreements but was not going to fulfill them. But I was still hoping that other participants in this process were sincere with us. It appears they were deceiving us as well. The only purpose was to pump arms into Ukraine and get it ready for hostilities. We are seeing this yet. Apparently, we got our bearings too late, frankly. Perhaps we should have started all this sooner, but we still hoped to come to terms under these Minsk agreements. What can one say to this? Of course, the issue of trust is at stake. Trust as such is already close to zero. But after such statements, the issue of trust is coming to the fore. How can we negotiate anything? What can we agree upon? Is it possible to come to terms with anyone, and where are the guarantees? This is, of course, a problem. And before I proceed, can I say that Putin then goes on to say that eventually there will be an agreement, but it will be an agreement that will be dictated by the realities on the ground, which basically can be translated to mean that it will be an agreement dictated by the Russians and imposed by them after Ukraine has been defeated militarily. I'm not going to discuss all of that further in this program, but note how Putin is focusing on the question of trust and is now saying, how can we negotiate anything? What can we agree on? Is it possible to come to terms with anyone? And where are the guarantees? Now, there's a number of points I want to make here. The first thing to say is that the Minsk agreement of February 2015, was very much Angela Merkel's own creation. We now know that it was she who proposed it and outlined its possible terms in a meeting she had with Putin in the Kremlin. The Russians have basically told us this, and there's never been any denial. So it was Merkel's brainchild, if you like, to try and rescue the Ukrainian army in Debaltseve and to try to find some kind of pathway to peace. Now, given that this was what Merkel did, as a statesman, if she was a proper statesman, she should have insisted on the Minsk agreement's implementation. And I'm going to say something else about the Minsk agreement, something which is consistently overlooked, which is a few weeks after it was agreed in Minsk, the Russians proposed a resolution to the UN Security Council requiring that the Minsk agreement be incorporated as a resolution of the Security Council and be made, therefore, a part of international law. All the Western countries in the Security Council, including those which possess powers of veto, the United States, Britain and France, voted for the Russian draft resolution. The result is that the Minsk agreement became a part of international law. It was no longer just an internal agreement between the various warring parties in Ukraine, guaranteed by outside powers like Russia and Germany. It was also a part of international law, and there is a duty and obligation on all parties to an agreement which is a part of international law to see that it is fully executed, something which of course Merkel would herself have known. So Merkel was aware that Minsk was being sabotaged. She did nothing to reverse that. She now says that having Minsk, even though it was never implemented, bought Ukraine time. It was able to build its fortifications in Donetsk, Donbass. It was able to rearm extensively with weapons supplied from Eastern Europe. It was able to do all of these things, and of course, by allowing all that to happen, even as Minsk was not being implemented, Merkel colluded in the sabotage of Minsk. Now, she did even worse, because of course in June 2014, the Western powers imposed sectoral sanctions against Russia. And Merkel linked the lifting of those sanctions to the implementation of the Minsk agreement. And of course, she continued to insist that the sanctions had to remain in place until the Minsk agreement was implemented. So the sanctions continued to be enforced against Russia. They continue to be enforced to this day, even though Merkel knew that the Ukrainians were sabotaging Minsk. And as she says in this interview with Die Zeit, using the time not to implement Minsk, but instead to reinforce and to rearm and to prepare for the next war. I mean, it is not just cynicism, but it is extraordinary cowardice. And it is Merkel, once again, looking the other way, taking the easy route, the path of least resistance. She didn't want to go against the Americans and the British, who were always unhappy about Minsk. She didn't want to be seen twisting the arms of the Ukrainians. So she sabotaged Minsk, and at one and the same time looked the other way as Ukraine rearmed and prepared for war, and looked and also at the same time kept the sanctions going against Russia. It's difficult to overstate the damage that this sort of behavior will have done to international relations. Now, as Putin says, the Russians have now lost all trust. But consider what the effect of this is going to be on the outside world, because whenever Western officials talked about the crisis in Ukraine, over that period, that long stretch of 8 years, whenever they talked about it in any international forum, whenever they talked about it in meetings with leaders of the global south, with leaders of China, of India, of wherever, they always insisted that they supported Minsk and that they wanted to see it implemented. And now it turns out, from what Merkel says, that that was not really their purpose or intention at all. They were quite happy to see Minsk sabotaged by Ukraine. In some cases, they actively colluded with it, as the British and the Americans did, and the Poles and the East Europeans. And in other cases, as in the case of Merkel herself, the person who authored the Minsk agreement, she passively colluded in it. She passively colluded in the sabotage of the peace plan that she had authored and which she was telling everybody she wanted to see implemented before the sanctions on Russia were lifted. So this is not going to make a good impression anywhere outside the West. Merkel is trying to preserve what is left of her reputation in Germany. But it's difficult to see how this article in Die Zeit, this interview with Die Zeit, is going to do her reputation any good, either in Germany or, I have to say this, in the wider world. One way or the other, she comes across as manipulative, cowardly, and, as Putin says, deceitful. Now, is she right? Did Ukraine benefit from the Minsk agreement? Did the Minsk agreement put Ukraine in a better position than it would have been in if there had been no Minsk agreement in 2014? Well, I'm going to say this. In one respect, Merkel is probably right. Back in 2014, and 2015, Ukraine's military was something that was shambles. The Russians would have probably made short work of it. There's a story that it's a bit contested exactly what was said, but there's a story that Putin told the EU Commission President at the time, Barroso, that the Russian army could be in Kiev within about 2 weeks if there was an all-out war between Russia and Ukraine. But I have to say, if Ukraine did get somewhat stronger, and the extent to which it got stronger is, as I'm going to discuss or argue, somewhat exaggerated. If Ukraine did get stronger over those 8 years, Russia got much stronger still. Now, the Russia of 2014, the Russia of 2015, could not have withstood the sanctions that were imposed upon it in February of this year. In February 2015, at the time when the Minsk agreement was signed, Russia had no alternative to the SWIFT interbank messaging system. Russian banks relied on SWIFT to message each other and to transfer payments to each other. Russia had no alternative cards to Visa and MasterCard, the issue of which was processed, the cards that were in use, the Visa and MasterCards, which were in use in Russia, was at that time processed outside Russia in Europe and in the United States. Today, Russia has its own messaging system, the interbank messaging system. It has its own payment card, the Mir card, and Visa and MasterCards that have been issued in Russia still operate in Russia because they were processed there. So back in 2014, 2015, and the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in February being imposed then, the entire financial system, the entire Russian financial system would have frozen up, and we would have been looking at a massive financial and economic crisis. We are probably talking about a GDP contraction of at least 20%. What some people predicted would happen this year when those sanctions were imposed, but what, of course, never did happen because the Russians had taken all these steps to prepare for sanctions of this kind. And it actually goes beyond this, because not only has the Russian financial system been comprehensively reorganized and massively strengthened since the 2014-2015 crisis, but the Russian government's own operations, financial operations, have changed radically. Since 2014-2015, Russia has developed its own domestic bond market, the so-called OFZs, which enable the Russian government to borrow money internally by issuing OFZs, which is how it is covering its current 2%, its current budget deficit, which is, by the way, just 2% of GDP. I mean, not remotely like what you see in the West. Russia does, by the way, also have huge savings in its sovereign wealth fund. But importantly, because of the development of the domestic bond market, the OFZ market, it's choosing not to draw on the funds in its sovereign wealth fund. And I'm going to add, by the way, that as is the case, as is nearly always the case, the OFZs are providing Russian banks and financial institutions with that alternative secure hedge which banks and financial institutions need when they contemplate riskier lending to the domestic economy. So the entire Russian financial system has been strengthened beyond all recognition since 2014, 2015, which is why it has been able to absorb the sanctions pressure so well. Back in 2014, 2015, there was a massive crash of the ruble in late autumn, summer, autumn, as a direct consequence, both of the fall in oil prices of that year, 2015, and of the problems in the financial system, the fact that Russian banks owed large sums to Western creditors who were not prepared to roll over those sums, so that the Russian banks had to borrow foreign currency from the Russian central bank to roll over their loans. That created a major crisis in the ruble. The ruble lost around half its value, whereas over the course of this crisis in 2022, since the sanctions were imposed, the ruble, after a brief wobble, has actually strengthened. So we're looking at a much stronger economy. Now, coming back to what I said, if sanctions like the kind that we've seen imposed today had been imposed on Russia in 2014 or 2015, maybe eventually the Russian economy would have adjusted, but it would have all had to be done in an atmosphere of extraordinary crisis, and it's quite likely that there would have been major political repercussions along the way. By contrast, Putin's ratings have steadied at just under 80%, and there's no real sign of any kind of political turmoil or crisis at all. And it isn't just the financial system that has strengthened. The agricultural economy has strengthened to an extraordinary degree. It's now clear that the industrial and manufacturing economy has steadied as well. Back before the 2014 sanctions, Russia imported a lot of its food from the European Union. Now it is self-sufficient in food. It even has become the world's swing food exporter. So the Russians, in that respect, have been able to use the 8 years since 2014, 2015, far more successfully than Ukraine has done. In fact, Ukraine's economy has weakened overall over this period, even as Russia's has immensely strengthened. Westerners, by the way, were oblivious to this. When it comes to sanctions, they've always been shooting at a moving target. Back in 2014, they thought that the Russian economy was essentially the kind of economy that Russia had at the time of the 2008 crisis, when and the outflow of Western loans and credit and funds from Russia almost caused the economy to collapse. The 2014 sanctions were an attempt to recreate that situation. The Western governments found that by this point, Russia's financial system had strengthened to the level where that kind of crisis did not occur. So in 2022, they've tried to implement the kind of sanctions they now regret they didn't implement in 2014. And they found that the Russian economy has advanced to an entirely different level and is now, to all intents and purposes, sanction-proof. The other thing that's happened since 2014, 2015, is that the Russians have massively improved their global standing. They've forged closer links, much closer links, with China, with India, with Turkey, with which they had a rocky relationship in 2014, 2015, with other parts of the global south. They are politically in a much stronger, internationally in a much stronger position than they were then. Now, I say all of this because despite what Merkel says, I can't help but think that if there had been a Russian march on Kiev in either 2014 or 2015, both the sanctions imposed on Russia and the international reaction would have been far more severe than she says. Merkel says that NATO wouldn't have been ready to impose the kind of sanctions that it did in 2022. Maybe she's right. We'll never know. But the fact is, had those sanctions been imposed then, the Russian economy would have cratered. When they were imposed now, the Russian economy has just shrugged its shoulders and moved on. So I think that's one very important difference to make. But of course there is another one, and this is the military one. And here I'm going to say things are a little bit more complicated because yes, it's absolutely true that going into the war, the war we've had this year, in 2022, Ukraine had a much stronger army than the army it had in 2015. It's been significantly retrained. There's been there was, as it's now clear, a very much bigger inflow of Western weapons or Western supplied weapons. Most of them were actually Soviet weapons into Ukraine. In the 8 years, we saw these elaborate fortifications that have been built in Donbass and in other places. So yes, militarily, Ukraine is much more resilient, or went into the war much more resilient than it had been. But of course, the Russians have also improved their military, upgraded their military very significantly since 2014, 2015. We're talking about the Air Force, for example. Nearly all the very modern Russian fighter jets, the Sukhoi 35s and the Sukhoi 30s and all of those, they've actually come off the production lines since the 2014, 2015 crisis. The Russians have also carried out major upgrades to their strategic triad, their ICBMs, their cruise missile fleets, all those sort of things. They've also built up their submarine forces. I've discussed this in earlier programs, and they've developed advanced surface-to-air missiles of a type that they didn't have in 2014, 2015. Missile systems like the S-400, the S-500, the Panzer system was already in early production in 2014, 2015, but not available in large quantities. So the Russian military overall is much stronger now than it was then. Now, I come back to what I'm saying. It's probably true that the Russians would have won with their 2014, 2015 military. They probably would have won their war more quickly with Ukraine in 2014, 2015 than they would have done in 2022. But always remember that what the army, the military Ukraine started the war with this year was essentially burnt out some weeks after the war began. And people will come up with different time points when this was so. Some say April, others say June. My own feeling is that Ukraine's army, its old army, its original army, if you like, had been largely burnt out by the time of the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk battles. Whatever, the fact is that Ukraine today is only able to keep fighting, not because of its own resources, but because of the resources it's provided by the West. It's the West today that provides Ukraine with most of its weapons, with much of its training, with its command and control systems, and with the financial help which it needs to continue the war. Now, it may be that back in 2015, that would have been more difficult to provide, though not for any obvious logistical or technical reasons. After all, the United States HIMARS missile systems, for example, which it could have supplied to Ukraine in that year. But anyway, maybe the Ukrainian military at that time would have found it more difficult to absorb those weapons. But the fact is that if you are simply talking about a war between Russia and Ukraine, then it seems to me that all those 8 years of preparation that Merkel is talking about simply bought Ukraine just a few more weeks. By June, July at the latest, without Western support, based on all that it had done over the previous 8 years, Ukraine would have collapsed. So I have to say I take issue completely with everything that Merkel has said. The only effect of her failure to insist upon the implementation of the Minsk agreement was to create a global crisis, to ensure that the crisis, when it came, would be against a much stronger Russia, requiring a far greater degree of Western interference, involvement, commitment to the war, in a way that has made the crisis global and had significant effect on the global economy and on Germany itself. How much better it would have been if Merkel, who was, to be very clear, perhaps the strongest statesman in the West in 2014, 2015, if Merkel, who had the support at that time, or at least the sympathy of the then President Barack Obama, had insisted that the Minsk agreement had been implemented, and if she'd been prepared to face down the hardliners in Kiev and London and Washington and Brussels. It's the failure of her diplomacy, in fact, the entire absence of her diplomacy, the extraordinary cowardice with which she behaved at that period. Somebody who seems to have realized that peace was necessary and in everybody's interests, but was not prepared to do what needed to be done to see it happen. It is that failure which has led directly to the crisis we're in at the moment, when, as I said, Putin is now saying that there is now so little trust because the Russians feel that they were being deceived, that what is the purpose? The issue of trust is now at stake. Trust, I'm quoting from Putin, as such is already close to zero, but after such statements, the issue of trust is coming to the fore. How can we negotiate anything? What can we agree upon? Is it possible to come to terms with anyone? And where are the guarantees? Putin's words. Merkel was the person who could have prevented us getting into this situation. And at this critical point, she failed. Anyway, there we are. That's where we stand at the moment. The grinding machine, the mincing machine, the meat grinder is at work in Bakhmut. Going back to that title in the Daily Telegraph, a title which is in some ways, I think, more interesting and more accurate than the article itself. Bakhmut is a death trap, draining Ukraine's tired army, and that's even that doesn't come remotely close to explaining the sheer horror of this battle, in which Ukraine, according to the Russians, is losing the equivalent of a battalion of men a day. In fact, earlier today, I read that over the last few weeks, Ukraine has lost the equivalent of an entire division in the battles at Bakhmut, and of course the toll continues to grow and rise with each passing day. And if you want to see how it all came about and perhaps identify the single individual who bears the greatest responsibility, because had she acted differently, she could have prevented it from happening, well, consider Merkel's words to ETHEREUM, and it will show, in my opinion, how she failed as a statesperson and why at this key moment in the history of her country, of Germany and of Europe, she took steps, or rather failed to take steps, which have led us all to the disastrous situation in which we are now in. Well, this program has gone on for more than an hour. I think it's time for me to stop. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our other channels, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BITCHUTE, Telegram and Rockfin. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.